So a very warm welcome again to everyone who's attending this evening, whether you're a member or a supporter of Christian Engineers in Development, CED for short. Maybe you have no prior connection with CED and heard about this through some other channel. Whatever the case, you're all very welcome, most welcome. My name's Mike Beresford. I'm one of the directors for CED. And this is the last in our series of Tech Talks, our current series, that is. And just to remind you of the purpose of these talks, it's twofold. Firstly, we want to increase our own level of understanding about development technology. And secondly, we wish to share the knowledge that we might have with others in our field of work. I'm going to introduce Jonathan briefly before he gives us his presentation. Jonathan has been a director of CED since 2014, I think I'm correct, and he's been the chair of directors since last summer. He's a civil engineer by profession, running his own business based in Inverness. He's truly a Christian engineer because he's also a reader in the Church of Scotland. And I was asking him about his, he used to be a part-time mountain guide. Perhaps another evening we'll get to hear his favorite walks in the Highlands and Islands. But he's also been in the past a part-time mountain guide, but apparently he's dormant at the moment in terms of guiding, probably not in terms of mountain walking. Jonathan, we're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say to us in the next 45 minutes or so about engineering in disasters. So I'll hand over to you. I'll be quiet. I'm going to spotlight you, and then you should be free to share your video as well.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Mike, for the introduction. Good to have this opportunity to talk about disasters. Hopefully, disasters that have not been created by us, but ones that we've come to try and help with. And of course, CED doesn't do much in the way of disaster work because, well, you'll see why actually as we go through this talk, why we don't do much in the way of disaster mitigation and so on. So I'm going to try and share the screen first of all to take us onto a PowerPoint, which is really just kind of a series of slides, if I can get it going. Can you all see that okay? Yeah. Right, so I'm just going to talk my way through the slides. There's not much writing, it's mostly pictures to illustrate what I'm going to say. But, okay, so the context. The South Asia earthquake, or the Kashmir earthquake, 2005, 8th of October 2005, there was an earthquake 8:50 in the morning, just around about where that arrow is pointing to in the map of Pakistan there. So you can possibly just make out Islamabad, not far below where the red arrow is, and then the epicenter was near Muzaffarabad, which is the principal town in Azad Jammu Kashmir, AJK Kashmir, which is the Pakistani side of Kashmir. Kashmir, as you probably know, is effectively split in two at the moment, with half of it administered by India and half by Pakistan. Anyway, most of the damage occurred on the Pakistan side, in the areas of Muzaffarabad and Bagh. So that's context. 8:50 in the morning. It was the month of Ramadan in the Muslim world at that time. And 8:50 in the morning, what happened was it was a Saturday morning, which meant that schools were in because they have schools on Saturdays in Pakistan. It meant that a lot of people would have risen early before sunrise to take their meal, and then after taking their meal would have gone back to bed for a bit of a lie-in, being the month of Ramadan. So a lot of people were in their homes when the earthquake struck. So most casualties occurred in the home and in school. Right, yes. So how did I get to be there? It's a bit of a long story, but I'll keep this bit very brief. A friend of ours here in Inverness, Shona McPherson, worked for Tearfund in a disaster management team on the border with Afghanistan, in Pakistan. Quetta is the town. And she was just in the process of disbanding the Tearfund team there. They'd been working there for 2 or 3 years. And the earthquake happened whilst they were disbanding. So instead of disbanding, they decided to shift their operations to Kashmir once they, ascertained that there was something that they thought Tearfund could do, that Tearfund could go operational rather than purely channeling funds and from the UK who could actually send a team in to help out. So she actually phoned us up whilst we were having tea here in Inverness one weekday evening and said, hey, you wouldn't be free, would you, to go to Pakistan for a few weeks? So anyway, we ended up after a lot of shenanigans arriving. And this is the military training ground or parade ground in Bagh. And that's the helicopter that I arrived on from Islamabad that morning. So, and the reason for the helicopters, well, that's something you don't get in development work, isn't it? You don't get UN helicopters flying around. The roads were largely impassable at that point in time. The two soldiers there are French soldiers, because by then there was a large military presence. There's a large military presence in that part of Kashmir anyway. Pakistan's got the largest standing army in the world, I think, pretty much, and a lot of them are on the line of control. So there's a huge military presence, and also a lot of foreign military powers had been working, been operational in Afghanistan, had come over to help. So that actually is a difference with a lot of other conflicts. The presence of the military and their role in this particular disaster. Yeah, because some disasters are conflicts, and this one isn't a conflict, it's a natural disaster. So it's a little bit different from other situations, perhaps. This was where we slept, a tent. And October, November, December, it's getting cold, winter's coming, snows come into this part of Kashmir in December. So it was getting progressively colder through October, November, December. So that's where most of us slept down there. This is taken from the roof of our office. We did have the use of an office building in Bagh. We wouldn't sleep in the office because it was structurally unsound and wobbled whenever there was a tremor. And the beam to column connections had all failed in the building. So it was a little bit, you could work there during the day, because if there was a tremor, you could run out the building quick, but you wouldn't want to try and climb out the sleeping bag and get out in the middle of the night. So we all slept out of doors. Thank you very much. So anyway, there we are, we're in Bagh. We had the advantage of a head office in Islamabad already, so we've already got a bit of a head office set up because it's been there for 3 years because of the Afghanistan conflict. So some things are already up and running, and we're just sort of finding our feet in Bagh and wondering where Tearfund will fit into the bigger picture of all these other NGOs and bodies and organizations that are trying to do something. So we're just going to look at the challenges that were encountered, go through each of these in turn, hopefully. The response, the bigger picture of the response, the international response, if you like, and then Tearfund's specific response. So we'll try and go through those three things fairly smartly. The challenges come in various levels. This picture was of an office building, a 3-story office building next to where our tent was. Actually, it's just the next building along. So that was a 3-story office building before the earthquake. As you can see, it isn't any longer. It was actually, and you may laugh when you hear this, this was actually the Department of Building Control before the earthquake. There are earthquake standards in Pakistan, and actually they probably followed to some extent, but Either the earthquake was too powerful at 7.6, or maybe they weren't followed all that rigorously. Anyway, a lot of problems with reinforced concrete framed structures, which they were very, very fond of. I don't know if many people actually died in this particular building, because it being 8:50 in the morning in a government building, Ramadan, there may well not have been many people in there anyway, so that was perhaps fortunate. Schools weren't so lucky. This was taken at a school. There's a discarded English textbook there. A lot of, something like 19,000 primary age school children died in the earthquake, mostly from collapsing primary school buildings, which were almost always substandard in terms of their construction. And they like these reinforced concrete columns or masonry walls, and then a nice heavy concrete slab on top. So the inevitable happens when you get the earthquake. This is the hospital next, looking at, again, from the roof of our building in another direction. The actual hospital building is just visible top right, but is not usable anymore because it's failed structurally. And again, wobbles around a little bit when there's a tremor. So this is a temporary hospital being administered by MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, and lots of policemen controlling people coming in and out. At one point, we were in discussions with how we might help them with various hospital services, but that didn't transpire. We were moved on to other duties. This is a typical street in Baag. There were buildings down both sides of the streets, but on the left, all the buildings have peeled off and fallen down a steep bank. And the ones on the right are still standing, but they've actually all failed structurally at the base. So that's a typical street scene there. This is a very typical sort of house construction, but just an extreme example of it. Nobody wants to go too close to this particular one. I wonder why. Again, reinforced concrete roof, masonry walls, and actually the masonry walls, although they look nice on the outside, when they're exposed, you see they're actually just kind of rubble walls with no tying together. And there was no reinforced concrete columns in that structure. So that was just up the road from where we were based. This is perhaps, this is another example. It's not, I didn't take a lot of really great photos from a structural point of view, but this one will illustrate a very common structural arrangement: reinforced concrete structure, nice heavy first floor slab concrete roof, and brickwork infill panels between the columns. Except the ground floor, they like to keep the ground floor nice and open because they like to use them as shop units. So effectively, you've got this really heavy building sitting on nice slender columns. The earthquake comes along, whoa, off it goes. And usually they collapse over sideways. This one hasn't actually collapsed, but it has failed structurally at the column heads. And some of the walls of the infill walls have fallen out. So that's a typical failed building in Baag. Moving out into the sticks, into the villages away from the town. This is a typical house. The triangulated roof is doing fine, thank you very much. Unfortunately, the rest of the house is disintegrated under it. This is one, actually there were 5 brothers. These are 4 of the 5 brothers. And they had 5 houses. And you can see in the next one at the top of the picture in the distance, 5 houses, all exactly the same problem. The roof is still intact, but the buildings just collapsed underneath it. The Tearfund's response, our specific response, we were thinking what we're going to do here, and we put out feelers with various different avenues. different organizations. And eventually we were steered towards working in some villages. It ended up being 27 villages that we were working in, rather than the town center. And so, my focus shifted towards these villages, which were generally speaking on higher ground above Barg itself. So it's people like these that we were trying to help. And that the most, if you like, the felt need of the community after this disaster was not water and sanitation, which is what I had actually been recruited as. I've been recruited as a WATSAN engineer. But actually that wasn't what these people were wanting. They were wanting, by and large, shelter materials or tools and equipment and materials so that they could make improvised shelters before the winter came, so that they could keep themselves going over the winter, and then the following summer they would rebuild their houses. That's what their focus was. And not just for Tearfund, but all the other NGOs working in other different villages were finding the same thing. The focus turned towards shelter, get something that people can survive the winter in, and then we'll start looking at rehabilitating water supplies after that. So that's what we did, shelter materials. And then the next thing that we turned our attention to at the same time was emergency WATSAN, such as, for instance, water purification tablets, buckets, temporary latrine construction materials, things like that, just to keep them going over the winter. And then we started working on the reconstruction of water supplies, which is kind of starting to look a bit more developmental in its focus rather than just relief. So that was Tearfund's, the way that we ended up working. In the towns, WATSAN was more pressing, much more pressing, and necessitated the temporary rehabilitation of some of the main water supply systems. And actually, unsurprisingly, perhaps Oxfam got the job of rehabilitating the water supply for Barg. Well, you would expect that, because that's a particular area of expertise. I would hardly have known where to start with that, but they'd done it all before, so they got the job of doing that. I've gone on too far. Yeah, some interesting pictures here. Now, we're used to seeing on telly in disasters the idea that the victim of the disaster is somehow helpless and just sort of sitting there in despair. Oh, woe is me, come and help me, Mr. NGO, and give me lots of stuff. These guys here in this picture, they built this shelter out of the ruins of their house before we even came along. They're not waiting for NGOs to turn up. They don't know when we might turn up or not. They were showing a real initiative, getting a winterized shelter up and running from the dismantled remains of their house. This is one of the rooms in that structure. They've got a separate room for the kitchen with a sort of clay stove that they've built up. Nice little home from home. They've actually, in 2-3 weeks, they've done a power of work. So the idea of the victim of disasters as being helpless and needing help, they're far from it. Very often they're very resourceful and will work together to sort their problem as best they can. But not always, Sometimes we came across one 14-year-old lad and his sisters and his mother and grandmother, I think, and his father and 2 brothers had died in the earthquake, and he, now being the head of the household, was trying to work on his house. And one of the guys, Sardar, and I, we were, as we were walking away from him, we were in tears because we saw his plight, and we really felt that this 14-year-old had suddenly was having to be the head of the household to try and carry all the weight, the burden of responsibility on his shoulders, and putting a brave face on it was really a bit out of his depth, So sometimes they do need a helping hand, and that's where Tearfund or whoever can help, you know. So, and this is just another example of people that are getting on with it. You can just not quite see the ruins of the house on the right, and they've started dismantling bits of the roof and building up a temporary shelter there to store things in. So that's that sort of identifying needs, I suppose, is the general heading of what we've just been looking at. How do you identify needs? And every situation is going to be different, and each village is different from the next one, and each family is different. So it's a complicated picture, and every situation is different. I was asked to go to Muzaffarabad by the UN to take a trip over to look at a couple of refugee camps. This is flying into Muzaffarabad in the UN helicopter. So some pictures from a refugee camp. Now, this is the old university campus in Muzaffarabad, a temporary camp for earthquake affected populations, or population camps, totaling about 3,000 people in this one, I think. So this is being run by an NGO in Muzaffarabad, and this is almost an example of how not to do a refugee camp, although in fairness to the folk concerned, they were thrown in at the deep end. And, you know, if you lose your house in the country, it's one thing, but if your house is disintegrated in a town, where do you go? You've got no choice but to end up in a camp like this. So this is the old university campus. And it's an example of bad relief work. But in saying that, I don't want to criticize the people who were there, because they were, you know, you have to understand they were in a very difficult situation at the time. They probably were doing the best of a bad job. So for instance, here you can see the lighted fire there cooking the stove. If that tent on the left goes up in smoke, as it may very well easily do, the whole lot's going up, because you haven't got the minimum distances between tents that you should have according to the standards. So it's a grossly overcrowded refugee camp. These are the latrines. You've got 6 latrines for 3,000 people. There should be, according to the sphere standards, you should have 100 latrines for 3,000 people. There should also have been 12 tap stands for a camp that size, but there's only 2 water points in the whole refugee camp. The situation got so bad that actually these guys from the Public Health Emergencies team have been drafted in by the government to go around fumigating it. And this is them sort of retrospectively, the authorities retrospectively digging more latrines and gradually remedying the situation, you know, trying to make it better. You can see them there fixing the what I call sandplats, but I think in English they've got a different term. I think squat plates, squatting slabs, which in time will be new latrines. Here they've recently erected washing facilities, or cubicles for people to wash in. It's a little bit worrying that I can stand there with my camera and almost look down into them, which isn't a good idea from a sort of privacy point of view. So I'm not so sure how many people would actually use them, but they're doing something and they're rectifying it. But it just shows you that when the disaster happens, things just happen. You know, you can't always control them, and then you spend a lot of time trying to sort of make a bad job a bit better. There is a thing called the sphere standards, It was in the second edition in 2005 when I was there, but it's now in the fourth edition. But it's still the Bible, if you like, the handbook for standards in humanitarian work. So that's the thing that you're supposed to use as your guide if you find yourself in humanitarian work, is the sphere standards. So that was that particular example in Muzaffarabad. Now back to Bagh and to the Tearfund team. So this is some of the Tearfund team that we were working with. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, actually 5 out of the 6 are Afghans, and one is Pakistani, and actually 5 out of the 6 are Muslims, and 1 is a Christian. You can probably guess who the Christian is. It's Nasira Christopher, a lady, because most Muslim women wouldn't be allowed to be part of a team like this by their husbands, whereas Nasira's husband in Rawalpindi was very open-minded and was willing for her to go and be part of the team. It's quite difficult to recruit women onto staff in a situation like this, culturally and with, all of that. So, but it is important to try and get them if you can, because they can listen to what the women of the village communities say. So, for instance, if you talk to the community, if the men talk to the men in the community, sanitation was perceived as a very low priority in rehabilitation work. But we were talking to the men, and if Nasira went and talked to the women, she would get a completely different story, and they would say, "Yeah, we would love to have some, latrines, some washing facilities." So that's you need to try and get that gender balance if you can, as best you can, recognizing that it's not going to be easy. These Afghan guys were great. They're all devout Muslims, but they were really good folk to work with. Engineer Naeem is the guy on the left. He is a qualified engineer. He can't read drawings, bizarrely, but he's a qualified engineer, and he was a black belt in Taekwondo. It was quite handy to have around. Now, this slide is to remind me to talk about a thing called Humanitarian Accountability Partnership, which no longer exists, actually, not since then. In 2015, it was incorporated into the CHS Alliance. But basically what it is accountability in relief work. The idea that the people that you're helping should have a voice and should be able to say whether they're happy or not, or make suggestions or get in touch with you. They're not just recipients who dumbly accept without any comeback. So, for instance, that banner with the old Tearfund logo on the left there, and it's got a phone number, a mobile phone number you can phone up, and you can complain about the level of service, or indeed say good things. But the point is, you've got a comeback. You've got a voice. So HAP doesn't exist separately anymore, but the principles of Humanitarian Accountability Partnership have now been incorporated into the latest edition of Sphere. So it's kind of all come together into Sphere again, which is still the main manual to go to. So whenever you're doing aid, emergency relief work, you should be thinking about your beneficiaries and how they can get in touch with you and lobby for things and so on. Okay, the overall response. Move on to that. Having looked at some of the other overarching principles, if you like. The overall response here, this is the United Nations, the UNICEF compound, surrounded by sand-filled oil drums and other things to stop people bombing it. and security guards, and you only get in there if you've got a good reason to get in. But I had to go in quite a lot for the various coordination meetings. I'll tell you something, you could spend your entire life in meetings in these disasters because they have so many coordination meetings between UNICEF, the local authority, the military. At times I felt like I was going from one meeting to another throughout a typical working day, and then only getting time to do real work in the evenings, you know. So, but then that's the nature of the beast. You've got a complicated situation and lots of coordination is needed. So you've got the UNICEF compound with the World Health Organization in there as well, and they've got fancy accommodation, great catering, a big flat screen TV with the cricket on it, and so on. And everyone likes to go there. But actually, it's a bit of a prison, because if you are one of their members of staff, you never get out of this place to walk around the bazaar or whatever. So you've got the UNICEF in charge of everything. A lot of the success of the overall response depends on how good the people are in UNICEF in a situation like this. So we had, for instance, a really, really good water and sanitation engineer, one of the oldest people there in the humanitarian sector. He was probably in his 50s or 60s, and he really knew what he was doing. Not everyone else was so lucky with their choice of coordinators. Even then, it's difficult because not all the NGOs attend the meetings. So you're left with an incomplete picture of what's going on. Bureaucracy can be a real problem. Not initially, it was okay in the initial month or two after the disaster, but by the time the next summer had come along, they'd managed to recruit the staff that they'd lost into the various government departments, and then it became quite bureaucratic again. So, for instance, if we wanted to work in a village, to rehabilitate a water supply, we had to get no objection certificates from about 8 or 10 organizations to say they had no objection to us doing this work. And sometimes they wouldn't sign the paperwork, so we couldn't work. The solution: talk to the villagers. Hey guys, we can't work in your village because those guys down there in the town won't sign the certificate. So the villagers then hot-foot it down to the town and demonstrate outside the local government offices until they get the certificate signed on your behalf. So your beneficiaries become your allies and helpers in getting through the red tape, which is quite good. This particular demonstration in the photograph was villagers from one particular village demonstrating that they were being neglected in the distribution of materials. Military, yes, the military. Now, in this disaster, they were a real help. Both the Pakistani military and, in this case, in that photo, it was the British military, dropped some zinc sheeting at various villages for us. But that often won't be the case in a disaster. Sometimes the military are actually the cause of the problem of the disaster in the first place. So you really, generally speaking, you probably want to stay clear of them. But in our situation, we benefited from having them around. So depending on your situation, they can be good or they might not be. Tearfund's response. As I say, we ended up working in 27 villages up in the hills. So the biggest single issue is, for us and for other organizations, was logistics. And this is absolutely key, this issue. How do you get, what materials you decide you want to provide, how do you get them to that village with the roads out, all the difficulties of getting from A to B, and actually getting, even if you get the stuff in the country, how do you get it up country from the Punjab or Sindh up to even up to, you know, Islamabad is sometimes a bit of a struggle. So having good logisticians on your team is essential. We were very fortunate. We had some good logistics guys working for us. So we also had the benefit of some helicopter assistance from the military. Oh, that was actually a Ukrainian helicopter that was paid for by the UN. And they did quite a lot of lifts for us into different villages. That was a road to several of our villages, had to cross that road. It was completely obliterated by the earthquake, this road, and it was a bit of a sort of a, we always sort of say, oh, please God, let us get across that bit of the road, because every single morning it was impassable again. Every day without fail, you had to get it cleared before you could get there. So that's us driving across it, and the military bulldozer has gone ahead of us to clear a way. So that was the only way to get to about 5 or 6 of the villages was along that road. And actually, the first time we got across, when we got to the other side of the landslip, the guys all got out and prayed. When we got out of the bowling alley bit. This is the vehicle of choice for getting building materials from A to B in Pakistan. These, what do they call them? Kekras, I think they're called. In various stages of decrepitude. It's amazing some of them even make it as far as Islamabad, let alone up to Bagh, as they've managed. In fact, here they've got it up to one of the outlying villages. But you've got to allow quite a long time to get your sheet materials and whatever it is you've got in these. You know, you might need a week or 2 or 3. So yeah, to get materials by these. Once the materials have got this far, then you're into either carrying them by, on foot, or maybe using tractor trailers, which we were able to use later on. This is a slide showing distribution of materials, building materials for shelter building, and also, I think by this time we were also distributing buckets and purification tablets for water supplies and things like that. So it all has to be sort of laid out in family packages, and then everyone, each family gets called forward and collects their share and hairs off up the hill with it. So that's just an example. There's a lot of paperwork involved in doing it properly and doing it fairly. And then when it came to the following summer, and we were distributing, pipe materials, a tractor and trailer was used quite a lot. We came across one problem in that another NGO, who shall remain nameless, bought up all of the tractor trailers. Well, they didn't buy them, but basically commandeered them and paid them to just stand around, either doing nothing or take that particular NGO's materials. So we had to get in negotiations, well, not just us, but other NGOs, and say, look, can you let us have some of them to get to our villages as well? It was a bit like vaccines nowadays, oh, I'm going to have them all for myself. So a bit of persuasion needed. Roads and bridges needed repairing. Actually, the British military did a bit of that in Bagh. There was a detachment of Royal Engineers rebuilt a couple of bridges. Just a general photo of some of the team. I think most of these are Muslim guys. They're all really, really good folk to work with. Really dedicated. recruitment was a problem for us. And actually that was one of my main jobs, was to recruit, was to make sure that there were people to carry on the work after I'd gone back. We had difficulty getting engineers within Pakistan to come and work in Kashmir. If they were really good engineers, in the sense of being able to be employed by, say, Halcrow or Mott MacDonald's, in one of their regional offices, if they were that caliber of engineer, they expected very high pay, more than we could give them, and they expected very good living accommodation. When they got there, and we couldn't offer that either, we were in shipping containers or tents. So difficult to get good engineers from Pakistan. So we ended up recruiting a bit of a mishmash and doing quite a bit of training of folk to get them up to speed with what we were asking them to do. Local technicians, inspectors, school teachers who had a good brain and could easily learn new skills. Local craftsmen were difficult to get hold of. You think about it, by the time the following summer was coming along, everybody's wanting to rebuild their house. You try and get a hold of a mason or a bricklayer to build a water tank for you. It's, just not many of them around that were free. Communications, another challenge. Communications, yeah. Now, the mobile network was knocked out at first. Latterly, it was, eventually it was repaired, and we were able to start to fall back on standard mobile. But initially, we were using the Thuraya, which is a satellite phone for most calls, and then eventually that was just for international calls, and then eventually we're back to mobile. We used a thing called the RB GAN, which is a satellite broadband. So if I wrote a report and had to send it back to Teddington, it was on using this. It looked a bit like a laptop. You plugged it into your laptop, and it had a satellite dish built into it, and you could send your documents back to Teddington. So that was the way we did it. These things are still being used nowadays in the same settings. So not much has changed, I don't think, in that sense. This is some of the other members of the team. Neil Duguid is a Scottish engineer who did a lot of work for Tearfund. I don't know where he's got to now. Lost touch with him. That's engineer Naeem, our black belt in Taekwondo again. Chap in the centre there, Arif Malik, I recruited him. He's a Christian from Abbottabad, and he's still working. He still works in relief and development work. There's Arif, and then some more Afghan suspects. The guy holding the black book, Sardar, was a very good friend, a devout Muslim, not a technical person at all, but very good with people, very empathetic. He really cared about what he was doing. He was a real gem of a guy to have on a team. Say not technical, but in just about every other sense, he was a fantastic guy to have around. So there you go. How are we doing for time? Are we over time yet? A couple of minutes. Okay, muddy hole in the ground. So more challenges. This is a geological challenge. We now know actually that the whole mass of that's part of the world moved up several meters in this earthquake. Part of the Himalayan chain being formed. What happened was a lot of water sources dried up, like this one. Previously, there was a nice bubbling spring there. It's just a muddy hole. And there's quite a few other places where we saw that. There was a whole high valley that had been used to supply several villages with water. And I did take a photo of it, but it didn't turn out well. And it was in the days of film, this. the whole valley floor was sort of ruckled up in waves and bunched up together. You know, the whole thing had sort of gone sideways, and all of the way that the groundwater worked had changed completely. So when we were starting to think about rehabilitating the water supplies, it was almost like starting from scratch, really, in many cases, because you're having to choose a new spring point or a new intake point. And then you can maybe reuse some of the pipes, but not all of them. You know, so in some cases, you're almost doing you're as well just starting from scratch. So we spent a lot of time wandering around these sort of hillsides with a GPS unit, surveying, setting out pipeline routes. These are two of the local village elders, you know, walking around saying what needs to go where, showing where the old brake pressure tanks were and the old tap stands. So we just had to, you know, follow these guys around the villages and come up with amounts of pipes that we needed and so on. This is a brake pressure tank being built, just a small holding, you know, a small tank to break the pressure so that the pipes don't get over pressurized. Did an awful lot of those. They never built them as we had asked them to build them, but they seem to work all the same. And then this is just a cobbled together bit of formwork for a water storage tank. And I think the next slide shows the completed one. Yeah, so it looks a bit weird, but it seems to work. Again, it doesn't bear much relationship to the designs that were produced for it. But, when I default towards polyethylene for water pipes, and we did use a lot of polyethylene, but you can only, the thing is with the ground there, in a lot of parts of that countryside, the ground is too hard to actually bury the pipes. You're just in rock. So, which explains why the locals like galvanized iron and pipe work. So that's just to remind me to say, yeah, we used an awful lot of galvanized iron in the end. I became an expert in galvanized iron pipe work and all the various fittings that you needed to order up in advance, as well as the polyethylene. And that's that's a photo of an existing, it's like a manifold on the galvanized network. You can see all these little snakes of galvanized pipe that have been taken off for various houses. And that's what happens. That's an old system, but we realized that was going to happen with the new system as well. So in the end, we just put in manifolds at each tap stand so that people could connect, rather than doing it illegally or anything. We built it into the design, so hopefully it looks a little bit tidier than that one. But yeah. And then that's Arif demonstrating water flowing out of a tap stand. That was a publicity shot for Tearfund, I think. It wasn't taken by me. I'd left by that point. So disaster relief challenges. So we looked at some of the challenges, you know, having to understand the needs, and the needs evolve and change, and in discussion with other bodies and NGOs, we looked at the standards of service you've got to try and achieve. We've looked briefly at cultural issues, a big subject, community involvement, not just doing something, but you've got to involve the community. And you can see here the principles of development are starting to creep in, even in a relief situation. So in response, you know, the big challenges of the response are the coordination, the bureaucracy to overcome sometimes, the military can be good, can be bad, depending. And Tearfund's response, our particular challenges of logistics, well, challenges that other NGOs had as well, communications, recruitment, that was a big difficulty. And then just the reconstruction work generally. And it's like development, but compressed into a very short period of time and with a few extra bits and bobs thrown in. And all of this was, you know, Tearfund was part of the Disaster Emergencies Committee I think. So Tearfund received money from the DEC in the UK, but there would have been other revenue streams, or whatever you want to call them, coming into that disaster as well from different different sources. I can't remember offhand how much money Tearfund spent on this this relief work. They were there for just over a year in total, because I think they finished by October 2006. It was probably over £1 million. It's certainly because you have to amass such a huge team and a head office team in Islamabad, and it's an expensive business. So you could have done the same thing, I'm sure, in development terms for a fraction of the cost, but it's a different situation. And finally, just to conclude, don't ever forget the human face to the disaster, to the situation. The abiding memory I have of the whole thing is the individuals that you meet. So this gentleman here, his name was Shabir Khan, who is a now unemployed dental technician because his practice had collapsed in the earthquake, and his house had collapsed, and that's his wife by the stove there and 2 children, and yet so hospitable. He insisted. I was there with Sardar, this Afghan gentleman. We had to sit down, have a cup of tea, have a plate of boiled rice with some spices in it, which wasn't much, but it was all that they had. And he was just so happy to see that people were taking an interest in him and his villagers. So it's people like that stay with you. Even 15 years afterwards. I can't forget his name. Shabir Khan. And this final slide is the view from is when you turn the camera through 90 degrees from that previous photo, and that's where he lives. It's got to be one of the best views in the world. But quite a wild place in winter. Right. So stop sharing that, and that is it. Try. You can see that what you do is, I suppose you could say that you try and make your relief work developmental as time goes on. You try and apply the developmental standards that we're used to in CED. You try and bring those into what you're doing in relief work, but it's not always possible. Okay.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. That's just been absolutely fascinating. It's also been very moving, I think, looking at some of the buildings and the impact as a real human, a story of human loss, but also a story of human generosity, I think, from what we've seen just when you were talking at the end. We've got a couple of questions already. So the first is from Owen Jones, masquerading as his wife Anna, but saying, reflecting on relief versus development, was the drive of the UN and NGOs generally to maximize number of short-term fixes, or was there a will, resources and time to plan and implement solutions which would not need to be replaced for the longer term? So thank you for that question, Owen.
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I could certainly, speaking for Tearfund, I would say that they were very much aware of the desirability of making their work developmental, thinking longer term, and trying to. In fact, a lot of the reports that I was writing were flagging this up and making the point. Spend a bit more just now, and it'll last. And we'll have a system that's fit for purpose for a long time. And they were very receptive to that back in Teddington. The guys there, they were saying, yeah, absolutely, this is what we want to try and do. Providing you've still got to do all your various analyses, log frame analyses, and justify it financially. But if you can do that, then we make it developmental. I can't really speak for the other NGOs. Some of them, I was very impressed with Islamic Relief. They seem to have a similar ethos. but one or two of the others, not so sure. And UNICEF were really just focused on the immediate, and they would be withdrawing as soon as possible. So I'm not sure whether they would be thinking longer term. Does that answer?
Thank you. There's another question on the chat from Nigel, who says, how long were you there?
Not all that long, really. Actually, I was there October to December in 2005, and then I think it was really only about 30 days in May, June of 2006, something like that.
So two separate visits.
Two separate visits, and I wasn't. They wanted me to go back straight after Christmas, but I persuaded them to, get somebody else to do that, because from our family point of view, I didn't want to be working abroad long term. But they persuaded me to go back for a short time, because they had basically I made recommendations that one of the things that I said in December that they had to do was recruit. Absolutely imperative. They had to recruit. They had to get people there, because it was going to be difficult to get the right people anyway. I'm talking about within Pakistan, rather than, I'm not talking so much about international staff. And they didn't, for one reason or another, they didn't really make much progress. So when I got back in early June, I spent most of that month interviewing and processing job applications and doing all that sort of thing, to try and get staff there so that they could meet their targets. They said they were going to do all 27 villages. They had 27 water supply schemes to do, and they'd only done about 3 of them by the time I arrived in June. They had to finish them in October. So they had to massively recruit. So that my emphasis ended up being, all that sort of thing, rather than hard engineering stuff.
I mean, Angus has put it, and I think you probably answered that. And Angus Armstrong, his question was, and you felt that was long enough to get your feet under the table and be effective.
Yeah. I don't think I put in less than 12 hours a day on any one day. You just work every hour you could. Well, it wasn't so bad in June, but I mean, this in the initial stages, everyone was a workaholic, really. You got a tremendous amount done in a short time. By the time June came along, there was a little bit more space to take a day off every week.
Well, there aren't any more questions on the chat, so we'll open it up to the floor. If anyone has a question, you just unmute yourself and speak. And if somebody speaks just in front of you, just allow them the floor. But don't be shy. We've got another 20 minutes of time.
So, Jonathan, just going back to my point there. I mean, it certainly sounded like you were effective and got a tremendous amount done. But I can imagine if you're only there for a relatively short space of time, just simply orientating yourself, getting your head around where places were, where you're going to sleep, what you're going to eat, how to look after yourself, just getting started. Was that sort of taken care of you by your organization? You're given some direction and to go.
Yeah, that side of things was fairly straightforward. We had a cook, Yusuf, and a chowkidar is like a gatekeeper, guards person. We all the various ancillary staff that keep an organisation working were there by the time I arrived, because they'd all been on the refugee project on the west in Quetta, and they just transplanted all the staff into Kashmir. So we had a ready-made team. So by the time I got there, I had I didn't have to spend ages. I didn't have to spend any time cooking or finding or putting tents up or anything like that. Just get down to work straight away. Yeah.
Very good.
Lots of meetings to attend. That was a bugbear, because there's usually be at least one coordination meeting with UNICEF every day, which you might try to get to if you weren't going out into the field, to visit a village. And then you'd have government meetings. Every so often you'd have to go see the military, and keep up good relations with them. You go see the Brigadier General, and he'd be there in his office with another big flat screen television, and he would always be watching the cricket. Yeah.
Other questions?
Hi, Jonathan. Was there a rapid needs assessment done at the start of the disaster? And it seems to be that it kind of focused on shelter rather than other things to provide. And you mentioned also about how some of the refugee camps didn't meet sphere standards. What was the reason behind that?
Before I got there, Shona McPherson and one or two others had got into the Barg area and had discussions with UNICEF and the military and so on, and they'd worked out. So before I arrived on the scene, we knew we had a building that had been, or remains of a building that had been rented, and we knew roughly. Well, we didn't know exactly what we were going to be doing. That evolved, and it was still evolving to some extent whilst I was there. But they said, well, we're going to do something. We don't know exactly what yet. But to some, eventually the area that we were going to work in became clearer. At first, we thought we might be working in the centre of the town itself, but very soon it became clear that we were more needed out in the villages. So the focus becomes the villages, and then you start talking to them, and they're wanting shelter materials. And actually, the same story was coming back to all the other NGOs from the villages as well. They all wanted to get something to survive the winter in, temporary shelter. So that became the focus. And actually, I think that was featured in the BBC News quite a bit in the run-up to winter. Reporters saying there's a humanitarian crisis approaching if we don't get all these people inside shelters before the snows come. So that was the focus that gradually evolved, but it was a constantly changing sort of thing for the first few weeks. It was starting to settle down when I arrived. Yeah, and and the refugee camp. I picked that really because it gave one or two bad examples, but the other two refugee camps that I visited, because the UNICEF wanted a report from us, an independent report on what condition they were in. So that's why I was sent there, and I did that report. But the other two weren't so bad. But different organisations had done. It was different people that had done the different camps, and maybe one person wasn't so clued up. But then maybe they just found that a lot more people arriving at that particular camp because it was nearer to where the homes were destroyed. So, and they just hadn't turned them away for whatever reason or told them to go somewhere else. So you ended up with an overcrowded situation, and then they're battling to restore some decency to it all. And when I wouldn't like to point the finger at them, because I don't know whether I would have done any better if I'd been in their shoes. Because all of that, all those families descending on that football pitch or whatever it was, happened, 2 or 3, 4 weeks before I got there. So who am I to criticise?
It reminds me of the refugee camps on Lesbos, and I think it's Camp Moriah, where they had fires, and I think 11,000 people were displaced from a refugee camp because of fires wiping out the settlements that they were living in. So it's still a very real issue, I think, that.
Yeah.
We've had Owen asking another question. Did you find being part of a Christian organisation made any difference, positive or negative, in your ability to be effective, and how were you treated by the UN and the local people?
That's a good question. Yeah, I don't think the UN treated us any differently. Don't think it made a scrap of difference to them. The locals generally were very, very positive to Christian organisations. The ones that they were puzzled over were the ones that were non-faith-based NGOs. They didn't understand the motivation. Why on earth would you help anyone if you didn't have, God telling you that you should do it? So there was never any problem there. We never had anything. Well, the team that had been transferred from Afghanistan were all Muslims anyway, so that they fitted in no problem. We did try and recruit from amongst the Christian population in Pakistan. Nasser Christopher, and then there was Arif Malek came on later. And by the time I left in June, I think there were 8 Christians. Maybe about a third of the workforce were Christians, and actually that was we found it easier to recruit from the Christian community, because generally speaking, people don't use Christians, and they're not in high demand, and so we had a better choice almost from amongst the Christian community, and found that, and we had to train them, a lot of them, but we had to train the Muslim guys as well. No, it worked out very well. We started in June. We started having worship services every evening, because up until that point, everything is dominated by Islam. You get woken up at some unearthly hour every morning with a megaphone blaring in your ear, and most of our colleagues are praying 5 times a day or whatever. But latterly, we started having a half-an-hour worship service every evening, and started singing hymns in one of the shipping containers that we'd converted to an office. So there was the sound of singing. I mean, there's no church in Kashmir, as far as I'm aware. I mean, there was the sound of hymn singing drifting across Barg at one point. So that was really good. And I was keen to try and do that, to encourage them and sort of build them up as well, and show some solidarity with the Christian folk on the staff, because they're often a persecuted minority within Pakistan. So that was really good. That was a good aspect of the work.
I was going to ask about, it was interesting to hear about one NGO monopolising the use of the tractors and trailers, and just in some extent in the development sector, there's competition sometimes between different NGOs and different charities working in different sectors. There certainly is for funding. It feels so self-defeating, doesn't it? And then you think, working in an emergency context, and how do you try to avoid competition, or competition between NGOs all working in the same field?
Yeah, well, the way we tried to avoid it was just to develop good friendships with as many folk as we could in other NGOs, not just the expats, but the Pakistani nationals there who were increasingly important as time went on. You know, the expats eventually all go back, but leaving the nationals in charge of it. So, you know, we just tried to be on very good terms with them, on, you know, make sure that we've got their mobile numbers and we can chat to them and see what the meet up occasionally. And actually that was one benefit of having these interminable meetings between organizations. Or there could be a bit of a time waste. There could also be a good chance to network and just to develop those links. And once you've got the relationship, then, you know, they maybe think twice about making life difficult for you.
Yeah. Thank you. Other questions? I think we've got time for a couple more.
Yeah, I've got a question, Jonathan. You started off showing the poor construction with the reinforced construction and the heavy masonry walls, that wasn't suitable when the earthquake struck. Did you see that they'd learned lessons with the rebuilding work that was going on, or were people just repeating the same mistakes when they rebuilt?
Yeah, good question. Generally speaking, no, they weren't learning the lessons. They were just building. In fact, in many cases, the most worrying examples of all were when they didn't bother demolishing the structurally unsound houses, but simply put, you know, the brickwork infill panels in between the concrete frame. They would put that back in, and the structures failed. In as much as if you can see all the cracks at the column heads, you can see that there's no, you know, the thing's kind of wobbly, you know, if there's a tremor. So you know that it's, at the very least, would need some major remedial works to bring it back up to standard, but they just go and put the infill panels back in without it. And again, they don't tend to tie the infill panels into the frame. So another tremor and it'll just fall back out again, I suppose. So there's that, and then there's I mean, that's sort of the bigger structures, but at the household level, whether they're learning that I suppose the householders might be more likely to learn the mistakes, actually. Once bitten, twice shy, and it's their own house, so maybe they would have a bit more triangulation in the walls and a few more cross braces or something. They may go better next time.
Jonathan, so if they did put the masonry panels back, because the column to beam connection was to provide lateral stability, if you've got a shear wall in the form of a masonry panel, could that not be made to work?
Yeah.
Or is it too stiff in a earthquake situation?
No, if you tied it in, yeah.
Masonry wall type of things.
Yeah, if it was well connected to the walls, I suppose it could overcome the shortcomings of the connections. Yeah. I mean, the codes were already there, and part of the problem is lack of, you know, the building control department basically doesn't really exist except in name, I don't think, or doesn't really do much. Except it probably does in the bigger cities and the higher buildings and, you know, the more major structures, but whether it actually does anything in the smaller towns, and certainly not in the villages, nobody pays a blind bit of notice to build control.
Children.
Yeah. So the traditional house construction there, called the catcher house, I didn't actually show any pictures of those. There weren't all that many left because they were just like rubble walls, and then a really heavy, and then a timber, like a timber roof, but then on top of that, a big layer of about a meter of earth on top of that, which provides very good insulation in winter. So they're quite warm houses, but almost all of those collapsed. So anyone in those just wouldn't have stood a chance, because you've got a really heavy roof on random rubble walls. it's about the most unsuitable type of construction you can imagine for an earthquake-prone zone, but very warm in winter.
Very sobering.
Do you think fatalism from their faith makes them neglect the building standards?
It could, maybe it could be that. There's an awful lot of inshallah, and or even amongst our team, everything's inshallah this, inshallah that, which is fine. But after a while, you think, no, we are going to go there tomorrow. But yeah, maybe it is fatalism. Yeah.
One last question, if anyone has one.
I had one interesting, and with hindsight, quite humorous event was we were walking through one village and it came to a collapsed mosque, and a group of clerics, Muslim clerics, trying to put a tent up. And so I started helping them. This is how you put it, So I'm busy trying to help them put the tent up. And these guys have got kind of weird turbans that were a bit unusual. And Engineer Naeem, the big Afghan guy, he whispers in my ear, saying, "We go now." Yeah, we go. Why we go? We go now. And I said, "Why?" I said, "Taliban."
So you went.
Nice to see you. I said, "You around, guys?" And everything. And they weren't local. They were from the Northwest Frontier province, and he could tell, because being a Pashtun, he could tell that they weren't local. I had no idea.
Well, Jonathan, thank you very much indeed. I just thought, I think it was Graham Miller mentioned this book, Engineering in Emergencies. I think he put an Amazon link on, but I was going to plug this thing called Bookfinder, www.bookfinder.com, and you can get books for about $1.99, secondhand books. You might have to put up with a 1985 version, but if you like one of, actually I shouldn't say avoiding Amazon, but if you like getting things secondhand, www.bookfinder.com, plug that in, and it comes up with cheap ones if they're available.
Yeah. This I don't know if you can see that, the
Yep.
sphere standards. So that's the CD of the sphere standards, and that's 2005, so that's out of date. But I'm pretty sure you can either download it entirely off the internet or get a CD.
Okay. Well, perhaps when it goes on the website, we'll try and get a link to that. If somebody, if we've got an eager beaver out there who wants to do a bit of a search for the Sphere project and then send us the link, that would be great. Well, Jonathan, thank you very much indeed. And thank you to everyone else who participated tonight. I'm going to put myself back on Spotlight just to finish the video with a bit of a flourish, so Jonathan isn't left with me talking and the camera on him. So yes, thank you to everybody who's participated. If you're not a member or a supporter, I have put my email address on the chat. So if you want to be sent a link to this, and I was going to say future ones, but we will, when we do the new series, we'll send you information about them. And you also might be interested in becoming a member or a supporter. And hopefully this talk will be up on our website from tomorrow, and also on CED's YouTube channel. So you'll be able to watch it again if you want to. And Jonathan will be able to sort of pick out the best parts. And so just finally, a reminder that this was our last tech talk in this winter season. As the days are drawing out and COVID restrictions, God willing, start being lifted, we felt that the time was right to draw the season to a close. We hope to be back in the autumn with a new season of Tech Talks, Tech Talks Series 2. We have at least one subject penciled in. That'll be about QGIS or QGIS, which is free GIS software that's been highly recommended as a good alternative to ArcGIS, which is quite an expensive bit of software. But if anyone has any other suggestions, please get in touch with me or any one of the other directors. Now, during these talks, we haven't pushed or even mentioned our faith, but these have been very difficult times for a lot of us. And as we go our separate ways, for a lot of us, until the autumn, I felt it was right to close with a prayer, a Celtic prayer of blessing for one another. So if you're okay with this, let's pray. May the road rise up to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face. The rains fall soft upon your fields. And until we meet again, may God hold you, may God hold us in the palm of his hand. Amen. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful spring and summer, and stay safe, and good night to you all.